a sign of it. Historically in Egypt, the workers' movement has been the strongest anywhere in the Middle East. And the old socialist and communist groups were strongest in Egypt. And for the first time for a generation, there's been a mass and militant strike wave in Egypt, led by the textile workers, involving all sorts of other groups, Suez Canal workers, tax collectors, and so on. And Mubarak's very frightened by this. And when Hamas blew a hole in the wall in Gaza, near the Rafah point, early last year, and Palestinians poured out into Egypt, they met delegations of strikers bringing aid from their workplaces to Gaza. And the combination of these two, sort of militant trade unionists in Egypt with the Palestinian resistance, was a fantastically potent force. So I do think that's possible. I think that's incredibly important. So this is a two-way street, because you're absolutely right. The Egyptian population are enormously resentful of Mubarak's government, because it's populated lowering the standard of living, and it's extremely repressive. And there's horrific stories of repression and torture of trade unionists and torture of supporters of Palestine and so on.
Yeah, I don't share the same sort of enthusiasm that you have with Barack Obama, because the Democratic Party has always been traditionally pro-Israel, and I think in the last election the only two candidates who were prepared to do anything was Ralph Nader, who was on the far left, and Ron Paul, who was on the far right. Both advocate isolationist policies, essentially. I think it's time for America to totally reassess its foreign policy. I think it should pull out of every country that it occupies, because it's just, it's going to be an endless cycle of marching into Iraq every 10 years to get oil. So
I agree with you. I mean, there's a kind of there's a subtlety here that we need to get to, because the history of America and the history of American presidents is exactly as you've described. I just don't think, though, that the left and the pro-Palestinian movement can approach Obama in quite the same way. In other words, you can't simply dismiss him automatically, which is why you've got to put demands on him. You can put demands on him without having illusions in him. And those demands could, in some way, putting pressure on him, because he genuinely has a mass base. There's no doubt about that, and it's quite an activist base, at least in the short term. And that activist base is very important. And so the demands that we raise are important, and in raising those demands, you help to radicalise his own supporters. I agree with you. I mean, there's absolutely no question of him going the whole way in the way I've described. And I'm also sceptical of the halfway house solutions that he might try to impose for the reasons I've suggested. But we can't ignore his intervention. We have to relate to it. And I'll say, up the ante, as it were, put pressure on his intervention to try to make it as progressive as we possibly can, both in the demands that we raise here, but also in relation to demands which are raised over there. And also have to be, if we're sitting in Britain, we have to be sensitive to how the resistance movement reacts. So if Hamas gets drawn into negotiations, and I think they will, and if Hamas itself starts to make some concessions, now this might seem, actually it's an interesting point, this, because Hamas is clearly a very militant, I think I'm not an Islamist, I'm a socialist, I'm not religious, so I don't particularly welcome an Islamic State in Palestine. On the other hand, I believe we have to relate to resistance movements, whether we agree with them politically or not, and try to influence them. Now there's absolutely no doubt that Hamas is a highly principled resistance movement, even if I don't share a lot of their objectives. I share one objective with them, which is to defeat Zionism. I'll say that without any hesitation whatsoever. But paradoxically, they could swing in a different direction. If they get drawn into the peace process, they might start making concessions, which I find as a radical here unacceptable. I need to be rather cautious there, sitting in London, making clever remarks about what they decide to do. I don't think two states are going to work, but if Hamas gets drawn into a two-state process, we have to be quite sensitive to what we say about that. This is what came up with the IRA. The IRA never said they'd accept a border. They never said they share power with the extreme Protestants, but they reached a kind of military stalemate, so they have no choice. This is what I see as a halfway house solution in Ireland. So is that level of complexity. But in the end, your scepticism is absolutely justified. We shouldn't trust American presidents, even as Barack Obama. We need to raise demands for independent pressure, independent movement.
So could you I think what you said about the refugees is very interesting, because it's, I mean, everybody can agree that you need a very fair, good settlement for all the refugees across the Arab countries. But when I debate for that, I find it difficult to. I have a hard time seeing how 5 million people can actually come back, like the pure sort of infrastructure that would be needed. Like, do you think it's actually possible to increase the Palestinian population with 5 million people? I mean, it would take half a century for that to actually be, possible, really.
First of all, in terms of space, it's certainly possible. One of the appalling things the Israelis did was to build forests over lots of the villages and hide them. And I believe this generation of Israelis don't even know where the villages are. They're going to have their picnics in the summer in a very nice modern forest and not realise they're actually having their picnic on someone else's village. So the space is there. So I don't think it's a problem of space. I think it's a problem of politics and acceptability. Now, I have an optimistic view about human beings and flexibility. And it's not just based on the abstract, it's based on real historical change that takes place. And I'll give you the example of South Africa. Now, it's not quite the same for obvious reasons, but the Afrikaner, the Dutch settlers, the Afrikaner settlers, have been in South Africa for 400 years. The Zion's only been in Israel for 100 years. And they're quite similar. The Afrikaners believed God had given them the land. The Afrikaners were absolutely adamant it was their land. And black people could have some of it, but they certainly couldn't have most of it. And above all else, they were not going to live in a society ruled by black people, under any circumstances. Right up until the last minute, that was their view. But they changed their minds, under massive pressure, and everyone thought, they've changed their minds, they're all going to leave. Hardly any of them left. Extraordinary. The vast majority of Afrikaners, of all social classes, stayed and lived under Nelson Mandela, under black majority rule, the African National Congress, which has communists in its government. The Communist Party played a central role, also a lot of anti-communism in the old apartheid regime. And all these things had to swallow their pride, swallow their politics, do a complete somersault 10 times, but they came to terms with it. So I believe under massive pressure, with obvious constitutional safeguards for everybody, because you then have to secure the rights of Israeli Jews, whatever we call that country that comes out of it. If they want to stay, they have to be allowed to stay as well. I mean, my own view is some of the real nutcases in the settlers. I mean, you see these settlers, don't you, in the West Bank, and they've all got American accents. Actually, most of them come from Brooklyn. So I think most of them will go back to New York, which is fine. I mean, that's really where they should go back to. But for those Israeli Jews who genuinely want to stay in a genuinely egalitarian society, then I think these are, I'm not saying it can't be done overnight, it can be done over a period of years, it can be done quite quickly, where there's massive pressure, all sorts of, when I say constitutional safeguards are put in place, all sorts of investments put in place to guarantee economic living standards and so on. But yes, I do think it can be done.
I was wondering, you mentioned like the geopolitical importance of Israel. Since that doesn't seem to be a situation that's going to change anytime soon, how important do you think the domestic Israeli position or conceptualization of the conflict is, especially compared to South Africa, where at a certain point Afrikaners and British alike realized that it was in their own interest to receive power. And that was probably one of the most important contributions to the end of apartheid that they themselves realized. But how do you see the Israeli society developing, especially with the recent Gaza massacre, where it was like 98% support for the war? Do you see Israeli society as a whole change there, kind of racist outlook of Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. Especially at the moment, public opinion in Israel is extremely nasty, hard right. But at the same time, it's fantastically fickle. When Hamas was elected in 2006, a mainstream Israeli newspaper took an opinion poll of whether Israel should negotiate with Hamas. You know, when Hamas was elected in 2006, it offered Israel a long-term truce, and Israel rejected it, which just shows you, I mean, the cynicism and stupidity and the United States and Britain went along with this. They clearly should have done that's what they should have done. But the point here is the Israelis' public opinion, Israeli individuals supported negotiating with Hamas, and the leadership said no. So it shifts. This thing is quite fickle. And there are, in my opinion, even more important, there are now a number of examples, I don't want to exaggerate this because they're very small, a number of examples of mainstream Zionists who said, we've had enough, we have to change, we cannot go on like this. The former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, Menon Ben-Ministi, is one of them, who actually says, this is an Arab country, if we're going to stay here, we have to come to terms with the Arab culture and Arab language and so on. That's a fantastic flip-flop by a mainstream old Zionist family. And he's a secular Zionist. There's a religious Jewish Zionist called Avram Berg, who's the former leader of the Israeli parliament, senior Labour Party member. And he said very similar sorts of things. He said that the level of violence we're having to use is completely unacceptable. He draws on genuine, good, humanitarian, Jewish religious ethics. We cannot go on like this. It's got to change. He even says, I've quoted in my book, we can't go on. He even understands the suicide bomber. And he says, I understand a 16-year-old suicide bomber that walks into one of our cafes and blows himself up because he's desperate. I understand this. It's an astonishing thing to say for a religious Jew in Israel. But he said it, and it's the leader. So this tiny minority, they call themselves, it's interesting what the description of themselves, they call themselves post-Zionist. It's a kind of honourable retreat position. They say, the Zionist revolution has occurred. Some of our great-grandparents had no choice but to come here. We're now established here. We do have a right to be here. Our religious origins are here. We have to learn to share the land. So we're post-Zionists. We're settled now. We're here. We now need to come to terms with other people who are here. So let's have a different kind of political settlement that's not called Zionism. That's what these guys are saying. It's tiny minority, but changes always begin with tiny minorities. So I think they're the wave of the future. And mainstream Israeli public opinion will get terribly. It already is actually. I mean, they're desperate. It's a siege mentality, but it's also desperate. By the way, lots of Israelis are leaving. There's hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are now all over the world because they can't stand it anymore. So all sorts of different processes are in train here, and this can be speeded up with the right kind of political intervention, both from below and from above, in the way I've been describing. So I think it can happen, it can change. But I agree at the moment, it's bleak. Without doubt, it's bleak at the moment.
You say that the one-state solution is the one.
In the end, yes.
But so what do we advocate for, say, as a student group? Because particularly in this university, there's a lot of Zionist opposition, and if we just went all out and said the solution is a one-state solution, they'd turn around and say, oh, they want to destroy Israel.
Yeah, they will say. I agree with you. First of all, it depends on, this is the Palestine Society, and you can be as flexible as you want to be. I think that those three demands are the key. The demands about the West Bank and the settlements and the occupied territories, etc., the demand about the wall, sharing Jerusalem, the right to return of the refugees. So I think those are the three demands. And you leave open the question of one state, two states. It's a debate, which should be left open, by the way. It's a debate that you should have. I mean, it's quite important. The campaigning organisations that brought all those numbers of people onto the streets, the Stop the War campaign and the Palestine Solidarity campaign, both of those organisations are careful not to come down for one state or two states. What they say is we're solidarity movements. Our main preoccupation is thinking of different ways of doing solidarity. You know, at one level, raising money, medical aid for Palestine, for Gaza after all the horrible assault and so on, raising awareness with films about what's happening in Gaza, twinning, twin Birmingham University with maybe a university in Palestine, exchange visits, demanding scholarships for students from Gaza to come and study it. A whole, you know this more than I do. There's a range of demands that you can raise, which are about solidarity. We don't have to get into that debate. On the other hand, we shouldn't at the same time avoid the debate, but let's call it a debate. That you don't have a position. It's quite legitimate for the Palestine Society not to take a position on this. To say some for one state, some for two states. And I don't know whether there are any Palestinian students in the room, but it's important that the Palestinian students have a central say in this, and their voice is listened to. And if you've got a split with the Islamic students and the secular students from Palestine, then both of their voices should be listened to. So we need to be extremely democratic, extremely broad-minded, and it's not such a terrible thing not to take a position for a broad-based society, as long as those political positions can be aired, and it's like an open debate. And I'd go even further. I'd say, it's a shame there are no other Jewish students here. I think you need to find ways of engaging with the Jewish students, asking for debates with them, different forms of debates, finding other ways of campaigning on them, perhaps campaigning on kind of low-key issues and so on. So, you need to be quite canny about how you approach this, and not certainly don't be intimidated by the Union of Jewish students, because although I know they've got large numbers and they are superficially very plausible and very effective at winning the middle ground of the not political students, in their heads they know there's a big problem. They won't admit this, but they're also having a major debate because there's a problem with liberal Zionism. This is a contradiction in terms after Gaza. You can't be liberal and a Zionist after Gaza, and they know that. So they'll try and dress it up, they'll try and say those who raise it are being anti-Semitic, they call people like me self-hating Jews, we got used to it, we don't care, we think it's stupid, and they know all this. And as I said, they're having a big debate, so you need to intervene. They can intervene in your debate over one state, two states, you can intervene in their debate. And you should intervene in their debate. And so at the edge, how do you do it? Discussion in a coffee bar, discussion in a seminar, I don't know, you know better than I do.
I think a good way to do it is to point out to Jewish people in the Jewish diaspora that by supporting, the actions of the Israeli military and stuff, they're not supporting Israel, they're supporting the Israeli right. I was at action a few weeks ago against the harbour in London, and I got into a very big debate with someone that had come there to buy some settlement produce, and I think I've pretty much managed to convince him that he shouldn't really support the settlement because it's supporting the Israeli right. I mean, we all know Israeli public opinion is very far right now, so they're essentially supporting Hamas. But as you say, it's fickle when it changes, and there is a left wing in Israel, the manifests against the war
and refusing soldiers.
Soldiers, and things like that, and say that they're actually choosing the side. And I think that really, I actually saw when I said that to the guy, that it's something sort of springs in their head that, that their loyalty needn't necessarily be with the state to be, pro-Israeli.
Yeah, I think as noble as it claims are that there should be some kind of a democratic solution where one person gets one vote, I think there's a danger that, as in apartheid South Africa, that the authorities or the hegemonic power will maintain economic power over preceding political power.
Yeah, there is a danger of that. I mean, that's also true in South Africa, as you partly point out, there is a danger of that. So we're not going to get everything we want overnight, but the importance of dismantling the apartheid structures was absolutely key to releasing other forces that can now start campaigning, and the same would also apply in a different kind of constitutional settlement. So the importance of dismantling the Zionist structure and bringing about genuine formal political and civic equality is just that, fantastically important. But of course, that's not the end of the process. It's just the beginning of the process in some ways, for a different kind of politics, a different kind of economic settlement. So you're quite right. And clearly, as in South Africa, there's still a concentration of wealth in the hands of the old white businessmen. And obviously, because the Israeli economy is much more sophisticated than the local Arab economies, the same thing would apply. But at the same time, after apartheid, there's been a rapid growth of black business and black commercial interests, and there's now some healthy competition. As a matter of fact, I'm a socialist. I prefer all of that to be overcome. With the crisis of capitalism that we've got, I think all sorts of alternative political arrangements are possible, where you can put demands on states to start making different kinds of arrangements, such as, for example, taxing the enormous wealth that's being made. So, for example, bringing in laws which reduce inequality and so on. So I think all sorts of things can be done afterwards. But you can actually take out of the equation the formal racism. And once you do that, you're clearly making a big step forward.
Would a good way to get over that economic dominance be a sort of temporary two-state solution?
It might be.
Yeah.
It might be. It might be. Again, I don't want to second guess how this comes about. As I say, we're back to the same problem of what happens with the refugees, with any version of two states.
Well, the only poll we've got to go on this is a poll in 2006 that said that only 10% of the refugees would actually choose to return. I mean, from my understanding, I've spent some time in the West Bank, and it's a difficult one to get your head around. But as I tend to understand it, the essence of the right of return is that the refugees want authority, is the main thing. It's not mostly, for most of them, about actually returning to their former land, it's an acknowledgement of the ethnic cleansing of 1948 and continuing injustices. And 10% of them is...
They have to have the right of return and the practical need to be able to go back if and when they want. I mean, like you, I've been there and I was astonished to discover I was in Jaffa, which is still part of an Arab town in Israel, but it's mainly now a Jewish town, part of Tel Aviv. But there's a refugee camp on the West Bank of people from Jaffa, and they aren't allowed to go from the West Bank to Jaffa. There's an astonishing thing. There's an NGO, there's a charity that persuaded Israel to let some of the children, the grandchildren of the former residents of Jaffa, go to Jaffa just to see the seaside. It's actually got the most beautiful beach, and these poor kids saw it for like 5 days visit. Well, I suppose it's better than nothing, but I mean, all that has got to go. If they want to be able to come and go, perhaps you may well be right. That's fine. There needs to be complete freedom of movement. I mean, Syria, for example, is one of the more progressive Arab states, which a lot of the Arab states, Lebanon in particular, have put a block on refugees taking part in the life of the country they ended up in. But Syria hasn't. So a lot of the Palestinians in Syria are very much part of Syrian society. It may well be they'll stay, but they have to have the right to go back if they want to.
Do you not think that the main obstacle for peace is the Christian fundamentalists in America?
Yeah, but they've been absolutely crushed. I mean, they're really weakened. They were an enormous power under Bush, but they're very demoralised. They are a problem, but they're very demoralised now.
But now that Obama's come in, he's inevitably going to fail because of the economy. They'll come back with a stronger Republican.
They might do. They might come back, and they're weak to what they do at the moment. They're very weak there.
I just wanted to come in on that point. I mean, even within Christians International and Christians in America, the opinion isn't entirely monolithically pro-Israel, and I think there is something of a shift going on there which could influence how they affect the situation down the line.
You're very quiet with that. You must have a question. You look as though you have a question.
I have another.
Hang on. No. Okay.
Yeah, another question about Obama. He seems to have brought in appointed a lot of Wall Street type people in his new administration, because we were just talking about the Christian Republicans, the neocons, so to speak. Now we have Wall Street. So what relation is that? What effect is that going to have on the Palestinians in relation to the economic situation around the world?
Okay. There's two things about it. That's an interesting question. Because we're in uncharted territory. You're quite right. I mean, we saw what happened with Obama. For the first time, he wobbled, and his base has wobbled. He's couldn't even claw back the bonuses from these creeps that basically ripped off the taxpayer. They nationalised the insurance company, AIG, because it's completely out of control, playing all these horrible gambling games. They nationalise it, try to stabilise it, and they go on paying these huge bonuses. And he can't claw it back. He couldn't bring the legislation to claw it back. And he was clearly caught on the hop, and it's quite embarrassing that he was. And he is too close to Wall Street. This guy, the governor, his actual title in the administration was clearly far too slow. People calling him to be sacked. So Obama's got a problem. He's going to have to get to grips with that if he's not going to lose his place, because the American taxpayers up in arms, quite rightly. The trade unions are up in arms. The trade unions have been picketing. A lot of these people have been going to their homes and picketing the homes of all these guys that have been ripping off the company. So there is that. But there's something else that's equally, if not more interesting, which is, historically, America is Israel's paymaster, and Israel definitely protected American interests. But the question now is, to what degree does Israel still serve American interests? Now, the analogy I'm interested in is that many years ago, Israel called itself a watchdog for American interests. I actually did a pamphlet in the 1980s called Israel, the Hijacked State, America's Watchdog in the Middle East, and the phrase watchdog was from an Israeli politician. And we had a cartoon on the front of the pamphlet. We had Uncle Sam, America, with a big hat with a dollar sign, with a kind of mad attack dog on a leash called Israel. Now if you think about that, the owner with an attack dog has a strong leash, the dog's well trained, it does what it says. But what happens when the dog starts dragging the owner down places he doesn't want to go, and there's a kind of tussle going on? In the end the owner wins. Well, I think that tussle's going on now. The Gaza was a pain in the neck for the Americans. It's a complete embarrassment, not least because of the damage it's doing to America's other allies, especially Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. So there's a lot of tension there, and the economic pressure on America makes Israel a very expensive ally, both economically and politically. So I think that puts Obama on some kind of collision course with Israel. How that's going to pan out, I don't know. My view is he's going to have to get some kind of concessions from Israel. He cannot do what Bush did, what Clinton did, and let Israel literally get away with murder. He said, well, he cannot do that. Whatever his intentions are, it's not going to work. So he's in some kind of collision course. How it's going to pan out, I don't know. But I think that particular tension is fantastically interesting and very important for us.
Because I would think that actually Israel will continue to serve as a kind of a big profitable kind of situation for the American arms companies. So because the US government gives their aid to Israel and then it goes straight back into the pockets of the arms companies. So surely, because on the one hand, maybe politically, it puts pressure on America, but economically, the more fighting that goes on, the more people go, and the more the Arab states around have their populations rising up, the more money the arms industry gets.
That's true, but the arms industry is a far more important lobby in America than the so-called Israel lobby. It's absolutely true, and they also use the weapons. They use Israel to test its new weapons, which is even more horrific. Some of the stuff that they were using in Gaza was definitely they were testing some of the American weaponry. But even so, even the arms manufacturers don't determine American foreign policy. They partly do, but there is a bigger picture involved in this. And the bigger picture partly includes just how much money America is spending having so many troops in that part of the world, and whether that's in the end the best way to protect the oil supplies and protect its interests. So there's all sorts of contradictory tension. So this is not a one-way street by any means. It's true what you say about the American arms manufacturers on the other hand, the oil companies, who are traditionally quite happy to go along with the pro-Israel position. They're now much more sceptical, and they're another big lobby, and there are other big economic lobbies who are putting different kinds of pressure on Obama. So I think that this is up for grabs. This one, I really do.
We've seen this sort of tension before, maybe around 1990, when you had Israel's position as America's catch-all weakened by the fact that it couldn't join in the first war against Saddam for political reasons, which was embarrassing to them, and the mass sort of increasing unpopularity of it as brutal repression of the Intifada. And George Bush the first was pulling at the leash a bit more. I think he even threatened at one point to withhold aid at some point. But ultimately it wasn't enough, and he just went back to the sort of default position of massive sort of US support for Israel. And I think a lot of that it's quite a lot of it's a default position. There's a culture of pro-Israel within the Congress, within America. And how long do you think it would take before once all of America's interest is totally
well, I think we're there now with this economic crisis. In a way, never before, all these things are now being costed again. And this is a very expensive ally for America, and people are realising that. I mean, there is quite a lot of concern, even in the American Jewish community, about this relationship. So it is now being talked about. It's early days yet. It is being talked about. And you're quite right, 1990 is a very interesting example. Because Shamir, the Israeli leader at the time, did not want to talk to the Palestinians, and George Bush's father, Bush Sr., made him, and he threatened to cut the purse strings. A $10 billion loan guarantee was about to be paid over, and he said, we're not going to do that. And they know, the Israelis know this. The Israelis know who the paymaster is. Even this creep Netanyahu, the new Prime Minister, who's an American, by the way, it's just absolutely farcical. And he makes all these noises, he won't negotiate with the Palestinians, the Jewish people have been in this part of the world for 3,000 years, all this stuff. He knows, at the end of the day, America calls a tune. And you'll do what America says. And America is engaged in this debate about rethinking through what its interests are, and to what extent is Israel going to be kind of toned down. So yes, I do think it's possible. I think war crimes, I think that's incredibly important. Israel always got away with these war crimes, not the first time, but now there's a massive clamour over war crimes. A lot of people are getting stuck in. I mean, Amnesty International, who've been extremely cautious about getting involved with Israel, they put out a fantastic report, not just condemning war crimes, but also condemning Israel's use of American weaponry, which is very new to Amnesty International. So there are all sorts of very respectable agencies. If you've been reading The Guardian, by the way, The Guardian yesterday, go to look at it online, it's got 3 pages, its own investigation into war crimes. Channel 4 News, a number of, if you think about it, a huge number of agencies, the best parts of British media, best parts of even the American media, even Israel itself, Israel's own Human Rights Watch, a section of even the Israeli military are extremely upset by what happened, because there's a kind of, I mean, it's completely phony, but nevertheless there is a kind of moral code in the Israeli army about what you're supposed to do. Now they can blame Hamas up to a point. You know, they say there's so many civilian deaths because Hamas used civilians as a shield, except so lots of the investigations are showing the way Israel are saying we bombed that building because there were Hamas fighters. The investigations are showing there weren't Hamas fighters, but there were civilians. And there's a kind of tipping point. So yes, I do think that's very important. And this is all adding to the pressure. Gaza is fantastically damaging for Israel. There's no doubt about that. It's fantastically damaging. It's also damaging in terms of Jewish communities, which comes back to the point about intervening in amongst the Jewish students. There's a big debate in the Jewish communities, which you do need to find ways of intervening
in. Can I just ask about what you think of this Labour Friends of Palestine in the Middle East that's formed up in the Labour Party? You haven't heard of it?
Yeah, I've heard of it. I'm all in favour of it.
Sorry?
I'm all in favour of it.
You're all in favour of
yes.
it? You don't think there's any problem with it or anything, or they'll capitulate to pressure? Because I think some of them are apparently also members with Labour Friends of Israel.
Well, I'm going to say, it's quite funny, I thought you were going to say Labour Friends of Israel, because historically, Labour Friends of Israel was the only organisation in town. It was the only organisation in the Middle East. In Britain, with a Middle East connection. So this is a good development. Now, of course, you're right. I say I welcome Labour Friends of Palestine, because the more the merrier. On the other hand, you're right to be sceptical. How do you do with Labour Friends of Palestine? I'd say let's have a debate. What does Labour Friends of Palestine stand on? Let's find ways that you can work with Labour Friends of Palestine, but at the same time, let's see what libertarians